Well, good afternoon. I'm Linda Goff, President of the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society. And today is May 18th. And this afternoon, we're recording a conversation between Harvey Buckhalter, a longtime member of the Society and historian, a retired school teacher from Albuquerque Public Schools in Los Lunas, and Dr. Dan Borenstein, whose family can trace its last 100 years or more to Silver City, New Mexico. And we are delighted, Dan, if I may call you Dan, that you reached out to us, maybe a month or 6 weeks ago. And from there, we've had a wonderful email conversation leading up to today's conversation. So Harvey, I will turn it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, I have a script here. I'm all set to go. It's my honor today to welcome Dr. Daniel Borenstein on our live Zoom interview. Dan is the recently retired clinical professor in the psychiatry department at UCLA and also past president of the American Psychiatric Association. And today's interview actually comes on the heels of the most recent interviews my colleague Noel Pugash and I conducted with Jewish physicians who served in the Indian Health Service. And before we kind of get into the questions, I just want to make sure, Dan, I want you to correct me if I say something that is not correct, and I want you to ask your own questions if you would, so that we can we need to be off track a bit, that's fine. We're not, going directly with a prepared script. But I did get your revised notes, and I am going to use them. I'm going to be reading a little bit about the family history in the very beginning, and then I'm going to and as I do so, I'm going to be asking some questions as well. So, you all set?
Yes.
Okay, the year is 1892. Benjamin and Eli Borenstein arrive in Silver City, New Mexico. That's the territory of New Mexico. Their initial activity consists of selling merchandise from a horse and wagon to miners and ranchers in the hills around Silver City. This is not very different from the path that many other Jewish immigrants took. What is interesting is these are Eastern European immigrants, not rather than immigrants from the German states, which were very populous actually in the Southwest. Then we come to and they're originally from Podolia, Gubernia. Why do I bring this up? Because my father was actually from Podolia, Gubernia as well, although he came to this country in the early 1930s as a young adult. And and my father lived there. It was still a very impoverished and not a great place to live because of the anti-Semitism, because of the lack of opportunity, and it was a place to.
So Harvey, that was where they were from the Chargarat shtetl. Is that the same area you're talking about?
It's about 20 miles away from where my father lived.
Okay.
He was from a town called Frumpel.
All right.
And they land at Castle Garden, which precedes Ellis Island. And what I'm going to ask you, Dan, is, was there a New York connection when they landed? Did they know anybody in New York?
Not that we know of, but Eli came first.
Right.
And worked in the jewelry district. So I suspect that was a lot of Jewish people there, as there are now, and he made a bunch of connections at that point. But as far as I know, they didn't know anybody in advance before they came over.
Yeah, you mentioned that Eli worked in the jewelry
yeah.
for about a year.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we are now coming back to Silver City. The year now is 1895. And after being peddlers, the original Borenstein building was a 5 and 10 cent store on West Broadway near their subsequent location. The operation began selling small merchandise and varieties. Later in the year, the brothers moved across the street to its principal location at 109 Bullard. And that's going to be an important address. The store carried dry goods, clothing, shoes, glassware, and crockery, Counter stools were provided for customers to sit and examine merchandise, and the store was advertised as Borenstein Brothers 10-cent store. Then a year later, the brothers began selling groceries in an adjacent building formerly occupied by all things a Chinese restaurant. And in the list of merchants that I saw in Silver City, I actually ran across 3 distinct Chinese names of other merchants. So this is kind of a sidetrack of the commerce in Silver City that, for all I know, has never been explored. They're also listed on the merchants as actual merchants, not just clerks or anything like that. The store's interior appearance was updated when Mrs. Ben Borenstein, Dora, arrived in New York from the Ukraine with her 3 children, Rosa, Pearl, and Jack. Jack is, of course, your dad.
Yes. He was, of course, his name was really Isaac.
His name was really Isaac, right?
Yes, Itzhak, and he basically just decided to become Jack.
Right. Not uncommon. In September, Ben was in Chicago selling the fall stock of dry goods. Later that month, Ben arrived from New York with his family. So that's 1896. In 1897, Eli travels to New York to, quote, select the latest styles and best goods for their immense new spring and summer stock. Okay, and then we move to the next year. The Borenstein brothers evidently are quite successful because they're able to purchase 3 buildings and rename the store The Leader. Do you have any insights into that, whether they chose that name or?
No, I don't. But one thing I learned, Harvey, is that it seems that the Borenstein family was already fairly prosperous before the brothers came over, based on a picture, an old picture we had, and there they are all dressed up in finery. So I didn't know that until I started doing this.
Yeah, that occurred to me as well. And hate to rain a little bit on your parade, but I'm not sure about what I'm about to say either. Those pictures were posed.
Were posed?
Posed, yeah, sometimes with attire that the photographer had as well. So
okay.
they took those pictures. They did not want to appear, I'll use the Yiddish word, schleppedig, not finely dressed, let's say.
Okay, well, I thought they might be somewhat real because of the gold chain that Eli appeared to be wearing in that picture, and it was something that they used to wear.
We really can't get to the bottom of it. Yeah, jewelry was something that they did value and they brought with them because they knew that had intrinsic value in case, God forbid, it came to the point where they had to sell it or something like that. So that's another point. At any rate, we'll move on. Okay, the year now is 1900. There was a sale of a carload or more of goods consisting of boots and shoes, hats, caps, all kinds of dry goods, notions, etc., which continued to offer remarkably cheap bargains for 30 days. Let's quote. The Borensteins have been operating a large store named the El Paso store in Nogales, Argentina for some years.
Argentina? You mean Arizona?
Arizona, I'm sorry. Did I say Argentina? Arizona for some years with Fred Borenstein as the manager, but last week decided to close it and ship the goods here.
You should explain who Fred Borenstein is.
Yes, Fred Borenstein.
He's the half brother of Dan and Eli.
Right. Half price. Gents, ladies, and children's shoes are on sale at much less than actual cost. The stock is the largest, the most complete ever brought to this city. And the newspapers in Silver City were like to boost, the merchants and be very exaggerative of everything. But, chances are this is a very factual statement that everybody awaited these goods and were very anxious to have them. So in 1906, the brothers moved across the street, and 2 years later, they returned to a new building with a frontage of 52 feet, which is pretty wide, very expensive, and a depth of 75 feet. So that's a large, large building.
Well, yes, let me explain a little bit about that, if I may. The original store was one of three single units, single-story units that the Swan family owned, some pioneers in the area. And then they operated in two of those small sections before this. They bought the third one, all three of them from the Swan family, and before they did this massive remodel, which resulted in a two-story building with sleeping quarters up above. And they took out the walls, so we had one complete open store area.
Yeah, there's one point that I'd like to return to. And one of the things that I'm interested in is the idea of risk taking and immigrants taking risks, because it was the exception to the rule. It certainly was not the rule among the immigrant population, the Jewish immigrant population, when they landed in New York. And people wanted to stay, they wanted to remain inside within the cocoon of the large Jewish community on the Lower East Side rather than take off to an unknown place. So this intrigues me, how they found Silver City and the idea that they were willing to leave a place where the language was familiar, everyone spoke Yiddish, everyone was familiar looking, they could make friends very easily. It was comfortable and safe. That was the main thing.
Well, actually, their first house was in Brooklyn at 636 Warner Avenue, and most of the kids went to grade school there in Brooklyn, as did my father and Pearl for sure, his sister, one of his sisters, and only later did they have residences in Manhattan itself. And then there are several addresses, different addresses in Manhattan. So risk-taking, I don't know why these two brothers would, unless they had some kind of word that there were opportunities in the West. This Silver City, of course, had this mining town sort of sense about it. We had the huge open pit copper mine right nearby. There was another open pit copper mine that wasn't really doing that well at that time. And they did have a silver mine that had played out by then. So I can't be sure why they were attracted there. If someone gave them some clue, I just don't know.
Often it was a family connection or a friend or something that drew them. That was quite a distance. It still is quite a distance from New York.
Well, as far as I know, they didn't know anybody in Silver City before they got there. So I just don't know.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Did they ever talk about their early experiences and hardships when they got to Silver City?
Well, see, they were both dead by the time I was born, or shortly after. Well, one of them died.
Family stories, yeah. Family
yeah. So I don't never heard any. In fact, they were very quiet about. They didn't talk about the old country, or I think, and certainly my dad didn't say anything about it. And I'm sorry I didn't probe him more when I was young.
Okay. So back to 1908 for a moment. We talked about how large the store was and that it featured a completely new line of nationally advertised merchandise, becoming one of Silver City's most successful and largest retail firms. The Borenstein block is visible at the top of the building, and separate department stores were created for men's and women's merchandise. That's interesting because one of the things that we're interested in researching the history of Jewish merchants is the innovations that they came up with. And this certainly was an innovation for the West. I don't know how many of the other merchants divided merchandise this way, but for Silver City, for sure, this was an innovation.
Well, it was kind of interesting too, the range of clothing they had for men, because the cowboys were around when I was first born, and surely while they were operating, they were hitching posts on the street to tie up the horses and stuff like that, and swinging saloon with swinging doors and sawdust on the floor. So they had a lot of cowboy type stuff in the store, as well as dress up men's stuff.
Right.
It was quite a range of stuff, I'll say.
So let's move on to 1910. Ben Borenstein returns from New York, where he and his family had been residing for the last 2 years. And Mrs. Ben Borenstein and children arrived several months later in June. The Borensteins reside in a living space above the store, which is rather typical. And a large warehouse was built in the rear of the store fronting on Texas Street. So the store is extremely successful and things are really going in a good way for the family. And 2 years later, Jack Borenstein, who had been in New York, returns upon his graduation from Commercial High School, which is smack in the middle of Midtown New York. The school has since closed, by the way. He was accompanied by Eli Borenstein's 11-year-old son, Barney, who will return to New York in August to resume his studies. That's quite a switch from going from New Mexico to New York.
Well, yes. So what happened was, usually one of the brothers would be in New York. So we always had somebody there, and the family could comfortably move back and forth as they wanted to.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was about to ask about that. In 1914, this is an innovation. Again, a steam heating plant is installed in the Borenstein store, first one in Silver City, according to the newspaper. And the Borenstein brothers also have a store in Pinos Altos at the time. Pinos Altos now was nothing more than a curve in the road, really. But at
That's
that
right.
time,
Very small.
I guess so many of the buildings have since been, well, since 1914, have been demolished. I'm going to talk a little bit about Eli here in a second.
Yeah, Eli, after he came back from, after they closed the Nogales store, he came back and sort of did his own thing.
Yeah.
He became quite a prominent real estate person in Silver City.
Here we go. So here are some of the things about Eli that kind of make him.
Well, actually, I'm thinking of Fred. I'm talking about Fred, but you're going to talk about Eli.
By 1912, he owns one of 75 autos in Silver City and takes part in the 4th of July parade. It's a 5-passenger Chalmers, which is kind of a top-of-the-line car. 1914, he does the big, according to the papers, does the biggest real estate deal of the year, a deal worth $150,000. That's an incredible amount of money. And I wonder if, I mean, it's just an incredible amount of money. When he becomes the owner of the Orient Hotel.
Yeah, now I would say one thing about that. Even though Eli was the name person, it was really the brothers were participating in this.
Yeah, but the paper puts him at the top of the list. So, in 1916, remember, this is a guy that he's arrived in Silver City only not even 2 decades ago. And here he is. Eli becomes one of the incorporators of the Union Exchange Bank. And in 1925, he passes away. So interesting how it's just fascinating. It really is how an immigrant in a strange place is able to, climb to the top of the heap.
Well, that's one of the reasons I was thinking maybe they had some resources before they came over, because it is an amazing story how successful they were.
Yeah, it really is. Before I go on, I want to talk a little bit about just New Mexico, the territory of New Mexico, and the incipient state of New Mexico. The Borensteins were not, interestingly enough, were not the only Jewish merchants in the Silver City. Going through the papers, I find many, many Jewish names. Here we have some of them that indicate a thriving community of Jewish businessmen. David Abraham, dry goods merchants, who operated a store in Silver City back in 1875. And according to the paper, where everything from a needle to an anchor could be found. Why you would need an anchor in Silver City is beside the point. Other Abraham brothers operated a barber shop, a hotel, cigar store, and a curio shop. Other dealers in general merchandise were the Schutzes and Henry Rosenberg. There was also a Jewish-owned bank, and this is really amazing, albeit for about a dozen years in the 1880s, which was owned or operated or started by Ian Cohn, and he is a topic for another interview, not an interview, but another time for research. The Friedenthal brothers, L.B. Cohn, the Schutzes, the Lisinski brothers were big in Las Cruces. We know about them. And later on it was consolidated into another bank. But at this time in New Mexico, from the 1880s, and I'm not going to be very specific here about years, these are some of the names that we find in the Jewish community and the mercantile community and the civic community and the social community. And the names are the Ilfeld brothers, which of course were huge. The Ilfeld brothers, where everything wholesale was available. In Albuquerque, Philip Friedman, Phillips Mercantile. In Bernalillo, the Seligman family. In Santa Fe, the Spiegelbergs, very important in early New Mexico in the territory. And later on, the Bells. In Las Vegas, again, the Ilfelds, Las Vegas was their capital. The Teicherts and others. Those are just the main ones that we find. And it's just fascinating that there was actually communication among some of them, but not all of them. And we don't know exactly how much communication there was. I'm just going by the newspaper reports when they talk about social gatherings and funerals, and who was invited and all this kind of thing.
Right. There were a family called the Mizels in Santa Fe that we were in touch with. They sold curios, Indian goods, and
Mazels.
Yeah,
Mazels, yeah, sure. They operated a big store in downtown Albuquerque, which only closed like 2 years ago. Very important. Employed dozens of Native Americans.
I was thinking about the Abrahams. They were very prominent, but they were sort of gone by the time the Borenstein brothers arrived. And I was thinking whether possibly they'd heard about their success. I don't know if there's any connection, but it was an interesting finding.
Yeah. As I remember, at least one of them moved to California, but that's kind of lost. Okay, let's go on. And okay, so we left off here with Eli Borenstein, the death of Eli Borenstein, and now we're going to go skip to 1935. This is the passing of Benjamin Borenstein in New York City. The store now turns to Jack and Rosa Borenstein. This is brother and sister, whose primary responsibility for men's and women's clothing was respectively to Jack and Rosa. Beatrice Kay, their sibling, was a third member of the store and worked in women's clothing with Rosa. And then there's a remodel in 1937. 1935, Jack and Rosa agreed with contractor Chris Hansen for an addition to the existing Borenstein's department store. This was for an expansion of the store to Texas Street above the shoe section creating office space and a children's section including toys, which I think would probably be another innovation, a separate toy department.
Could be. I got my Lionel train from that store and I still have it.
Yeah. So let me ask you now, as a young man, did you hang around the store a lot?
Did I hang out a lot?
In the store, you were around the store.
Actually, I did visit it a lot. The city was small enough that I could skate from our home to the store on roller skates. And so I did go there fairly often. And when I was about, it seems like I was about 6. I must have been older. I actually was permitted to do to pretend I was a salesman. And that created quite a bit of humor in the store, as you might imagine. They spoke English all the time, but when the brothers wanted to discuss something in private, if a customer regarding a purchase or something, they then switched to Yiddish.
So did you understand any Yiddish at all?
Very little at that time.
Okay. Okay. Then there's going to be a. I'm going to skip to 1950, which is the final remodel of the store, and it becomes quite fancy. A new Borenstein sign is erected above the marble front. 1964 is the passing of Jack Borenstein, survived by his spouse Marjorie and his 2 sons, David and Daniel. And the management is shifted to Rosa and Barney Borenstein. And then 2 years later, unfortunately, the business is sold. And Rosa says, because we are not able to carry on.
Sounds like we're getting some feedback from your mic or someplace.
Not mine.
Oh.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'll get a little closer there. And the store is leased to one Robert P. Alexander. He makes promises to make the store bigger and better, and he fails to achieve what he stated. The store's merchandise is sold off. He defaults on the lease. The building is sold, and in April, at least, it's still up for sale. So but I want to get back to a couple of things that we didn't talk about in other than the store. And one of the big things is the Gila Theater.
Yes.
Which 1949 opens up, premiering on the town. It's described in the papers as a magnificent new theater building. I'm going to read a little bit about it. On the corner of Bullard and Kelly, and then in parentheses, Market Street. So I guess that street has 2 names, or they switched the names, something like that.
Yeah, that was a little confusing.
Yeah, it's a $140,000 investment, and it features the latest in both projection and sound, one of the finest movie theaters in the Southwest. The theater featured a flamboyant marquee with an unusual design of myriad neon tubes and white, which proclaimed the Gila. The interior of the auditorium is both beautiful and breathtaking, and it was built, of course, by 2 of Silver City's best known and most successful businessmen, W.J. Josh Brent and Jack Borenstein. If it had neon on it, this is certain. Interestingly enough, neon in New Mexico reverts to a Jewish-owned business by the Spectors. That's the Xeon Sign Company. And I had the pleasure of interviewing the Spectors for a story for Legacy and for Zoom as well. Not on Zoom, a live interview. So there's a kind of an interesting, out of the way Jewish connection to the Gila Theater, having to do with the neon.
Did it describe the interior The ceiling of that,
The description goes on and on, yeah.
the ceiling of that
The highlights of
was amazing. The design and what it pictured, it was really quite a
something.
work of art.
What happened to it?
Well, after my dad died, I think it became harder for the leaseholder to manage it. I'm not sure how, but we actually wound up, my brother and I wound up with the theater, and we donated the theater building to the city in hopes it would be used as a performing arts center. And it was for a short while. And then the city basically sold it. That was that. It didn't wind up the way we hoped it would.
Yeah. But is it empty now? Is it?
No, they have shops in there, commercial shops. Two of them on the ground floor, as far as I can tell.
Okay, I want to move on a little bit here to
Well, my father and Josh Brandt, they did a number of projects together, including building a very large garage on Broadway near where they had their original store. So they were quite buddies. They went deer hunting together and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, he had quite a history as well as his family history with Jesse James as well as mentioned in.
It was Billy the Kid. Billy the Kid actually went to grade school there. He lived there for a while. I don't know if you want to get into that. He was jailed and escaped from the jail. I mean, it is a very colorful history.
Yeah, I was going to ask about some of the colorful characters you might remember growing up in Silver City. This is a good time to talk about it.
Well, I mean, he was there long before me, of course, but
heard about.
There were colorful people, including two prominent brothels, which became rather well known. And Borenstein Stores actually wound up making costumes for some of the women that worked there. But there were colorful characters. I think you probably read about the Banks family, where Mrs. Banks' mother was actually a freed slave that some family had supported, and then she did not live in Silver City, but her daughter and the daughter's son, Johnny Banks, was prominent. He had some birth injury, I believe, and so he wasn't able to fully participate in society, but he was a prominent figure there, walking around all the time and very friendly. Everybody liked him.
For a small town, there were a lot of interesting people.
There were. I mean, my doctor was Dr. Frazen. He was one of the Jewish citizens there in Silver City. We had several prominent Chinese families. Our grocer, White Toy, was very, very well known, one of the best grocery stores in town. And there was a guy named Lim who had a restaurant. I got acquainted with Chinese food early in life because we went there quite a bit.
What Jewish boy isn't?
And of course, Mexican restaurants and all kinds of Mexican food have always remained a favorite now.
Right. I'm going to talk a little bit about your dad now, about Jack Isaac. Okay. 1933 to 1941, we find him on the city council of Silver City. We also find he has quite a background as an elk and also as a Mason. He is the past exalted ruler of the Silver City Elks. I guess that's the highest you can go.
It is. He was a 32nd degree Mason, a Shriner,
Right.
in Shriner activities.
Yeah, and former president of the Chamber of Commerce. And this is really interesting. He was a World War I vet, stationed pretty much stateside, and worked as a Spanish translator. And
We should be clear about that. He wasn't stateside most of the time. He has training. I mean, he went in toward the end of the war and did actually go overseas. I don't know if you.
Yeah, I was talking about his training. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. He did go overseas, but from what I was able to gather, he enlisted in 1918, which seemed a little bit odd on the timing of all of this. So I don't know exactly how that date came to be.
Yeah, he enlisted at Camp Cody, which was in Deming.
Right.
Yeah.
They have him listed as a Spanish translator.
He did. He helped out in that when he was in that area, and some of his other posts he could help out because he could speak Spanish before he went overseas. And he actually did some typing for him as well. So he's helping out with the officers and officials.
So can you tell us a little bit, this kind of leads to another question about the clientele that were in the store, the people that shop there, and the people that work there as well. Could you fill us in on a little bit about that?
I think most of the prominent families in Silver City shopped at the store. It offered some high-end merchandise that the other stores didn't, and probably a wider selection too. There were some other stores in town, but not as large as this one. And there weren't besides the family that worked there weren't any other Jewish people working in the store. My mother actually worked there for a little while before she and my dad were married, but it was quite busy, and as I say, it had a wide variety of people though, because they offered such a wide variety of products. And I think probably some of the things are more expensive than most people could afford. Now, Silver City itself was 60% Mexican families that lived in an area called Chihuahua Hill, which was at one end of the city. And our maid was one of those people and she was a great part of the family. She actually, she helped raise me. And the story is the first word I spoke was Spanish word. I don't know if it's true or not. She would accompany us to Long Beach when we traveled out there for vacations. But anyway, it was a very friendly place. We had a seamstress, as I sort of implied, separate, so they could make clothes as well as sell ready-to-wear things. And they had lots of fabrics and quite an extensive array of stuff.
Well, the Borensteins did employ quite a few people. I remember that Eli's laundry employed 22 people.
I don't think we had that many people.
That's what it said in the again, boosterism from the newspapers.
Barney started working in the store at some point. I guess it came into play there in the story. And then he joined B as a junior partner. But there weren't that many employees. I would say probably only maybe 4 or 5 on each side of the store.
Yeah. Okay, great. Going back to Jack for a moment, 1914, he buys a Buick Roadster, another top of the line automobile.
Yeah, that was kind of surprising, and seeing all these newspaper stories about how involved they were with these cars.
Races too.
Yeah, Eli, of course, was buying them, and they had got them from El Paso.
Yeah.
And that's, and yeah, I had no idea they were into all this stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing.
I have pictures of some of these old cars that I've donated a lot of this stuff to the Silver City Museum. So anybody wants to see it, they'll be able to see it.
We will definitely make sure we see that. And again, in 1955, he urges the creation of a merchants association so that the people who own stores can fix the hours of operation and, you know, general rules and general ways of doing business. And that was interesting too. I would count that as an innovation for sure.
Yes, that seemed like a good thing to do and forward thinking.
Yeah, and we have, you know, going through my own research, I find all kinds of innovations that Jewish merchants made in New Mexico when they came here, including the idea of a self-service pharmacy. It seems to have originated in Albuquerque, and cash and carry florist, which definitely originated in Albuquerque with other Jewish families. So we could actually make a list of all of these interesting innovations that occurred. I have just a little bit more to go, and that is some general questions that I have about things in New Mexico. For example, you know, you're a Jewish family, and did you encounter any anti-Semitism at all, or anything?
Oh yes,
To it?
of course I did.
You did.
There was, yes, there was prejudice among peers. One of them threw a beer bottle at me in a car once, a full beer bottle, a can. They called me names at times, but there was prejudice toward a family there, a German family. I called the son. His name was Herman Yulee, and they called him Herman the German. I mean, there was prejudice that I guess anybody that came there that was different, I guess is a natural tendency, and kids are mean. Kids tend to be mean. That's just the way it is. I mean, there was some prejudice against Mexicans. I'm sure probably prejudice against Chinese too. I didn't run into that, but yeah, it was there.
Well, I'm glad you're mentioning this because, of course, the Silver City newspapers gloss over all of that kind of thing. But yet, in reading between the lines, you kind of get the feeling that there was something going on.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I'm kind of coming to the end of my questions was there a competition between the Borenstein Brothers store and the other Jewish-owned store? The Schutz's owned the store, the Schiff's owned the store for a while.
Yeah. Well, there was, I think they had somewhat different merchandise, so it didn't seem like they got along fine. I think they were friends. Getting back to the prejudice thing for a minute, I didn't realize that the Jewish families couldn't travel to major cities and stay in hotels. They weren't permitted to stay in hotels. I did notice when I was a kid that my father would register as Dr. Jenkins. And I wondered, why is he doing that? And now I understand fully why he was doing that, because he wouldn't have been permitted to stay there otherwise.
That's fascinating. That's nowhere in the research that I was able to do.
No, it wasn't in the research. I kind of learned this as I was going through it and talking to people about it that lived in Arizona and knew about it. So when we would drive from Silver City to Long Beach, California, obviously we had to find places we could stay. And I think even in El Paso, he used Dr. Jenkins when we stayed down there. Because just like with the blacks, the Jews weren't allowed to stay in these hotels.
Something I never encountered myself because we didn't travel. stayed in one place.
I do have a funny vignette about somebody that was in Silver City and I ran into many, many years later. If you want to hear it, I don't know if it's...
Let's hear it.
Okay, well, I came out to LA when I had my analytic training, and one of my supervisors, after I graduated, was a friend, and I'd have him over. His name was Lou Fielding. He was Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist. And anyway, Lou Fielding has come over, and we had a son that was a few months old. And as Lou was leaving, I was holding, Lou came out to New Mexico with the WPA, I guess it was. He said you couldn't make a living as a doctor in New York, where he was from. Doctors were driving taxis, so he was out in New Mexico in WPA. I had no idea about this, but I'm holding this son, and as he's leaving, he says, "How old is he?" And I tell him, and he says, "You know, I saw your dad holding you about that age." And it just kind of, he'd been quiet about this the whole time I had known him until that moment.
That's a good story.
It's a good story.
It's a good story. Do you have any other memorable anecdotes you'd like to share with us? You've been asking a lot of questions, and you've been answering them wonderfully. And I want to make sure that there's nothing that you're going to say to yourself afterwards, "Gee, I wish I had said that."
I'm sure there'll be lots of things.
Yeah, kind of egging you on a little bit now.
I mean, it was, I think, growing up in Silver City, we had a strong sense of right and wrong. I mean, my mother didn't believe in sparing the rod to spoil the child, kind of thing. I believed a person's word is the person. If you say something, you mean it, you follow through with that. And it was kind of hard for me to adjust to understanding that other people don't have those same kind of firm beliefs. But anyway, I thought it was a great life there. It was a great experience. And small towns had a lot of things. You could get in a lot of mischief, of course, but I got to associate with all kinds of people, and I think that was a good experience. It helped me, it helped my brother, and so we did okay.
I think that will do it for today. We have so much information. We had such a pleasure talking to you, Linda and I.
I thought you were going to talk about NMMI and so forth, but you did. I thought you were going to talk about the military school.
Oh yeah, I forgot. I'm sorry. Yeah, you left for military school at New Mexico Military Institute, and go ahead.
Okay, well, you had to have 1 year of high school before you go there. New Mexico Military Institute had 3 years of high school, and it was junior high school, 2 years of college. And my brother was there before me, and then I went there willingly because I thought I might get a little better education, and I was very interested in learning. So I spent 3 years there, and I know it's kind of, you don't really want to brag about yourself, but anyway, I did well there, and then went on to MIT. I met with the MIT admissions director while I was there. He came to Roswell, and I said to him, "Well, do you think I have a good chance of getting in?" And he says, "I think you have a good chance." And so it was the only place I applied to, and sure enough, I did get it. So.
But you came back to Roswell, to Silver City on visits to your family and friends and things like that.
I had friends I played with. I lost track of them. I had a very friend that had a family that struggled a bit, and they would pick cotton in Deming for trying to pick up some extra money, and I went with them once to try to do that. I tried firefighting, see how that was while I was there. I learned to hunt and shoot and all that stuff. Had a wide variety of experiences. I built a hot rod with the help of a neighbor across the street.
Tell you, these are things you would not have done had your family stayed in New York.
That's true. If we'd been in a big city, these things wouldn't have happened. I could walk out my back door and go hunting if I wanted to, or hiking. I mean, the mountains started at the end of the block.
Right.
So, it was quite probably an unusual childhood.
Anything else you'd like to share with us?
Well, I don't think so. I had a loving family. My mother, I don't know if you want to get into the whole thing about, she was not Jewish to start with. She did a formal conversion in El Paso, which was the closest temple. And so we didn't have much of a religious upbringing because there was no temple nearby. And my dad actually, and I believe his father as well, got involved with the Masons and believed that was part of their religion.
Yeah. And here you are being interviewed by the New Mexico Jewish Historical Society.
Yeah, that's right. Finally, when I got to college, I'd go home with some of my fraternity brothers who were Jewish, and I began to learn about Jewish customs. I didn't even know the customs of Seder and the Haggadah and all that stuff. I didn't know anything about it. And even though I'd had some of the traditional foods at home, I didn't know why they were serving them.
Yeah.
So,
well, this is not that unusual among some of the Jewish families, and when they're kind of in the hinterlands of New Mexico. Yeah. It's not unusual at all. We hear when we do interviews. This is the kind of thing that we often hear. Linda, did you want to add anything?
I'd like to thank both of you for your time this afternoon and a really interesting beginning of a family story. And Dan, I am quite sure that we will be back in touch with you to learn more, because I know Harvey is keen to write at least an article or two. And we hope you'll continue to share with us, Dan, the photos and other documents that you have so far. And we're very grateful for your having reached out to us. And, as Harvey said to me, in the run up to this, this area of New Mexico is one that we know very little about in terms of its Jewish history. Even though there may not have been many Jews, it was a real gaping hole in terms of this part of the state and not knowing very much. And so we thank you for making a huge contribution to our knowledge and history. It's very
a lot of gaps.
Thank you both. I'm glad to share, and I'll be happy to cooperate in offering any more documents or information I can.
Well, that would be terrific. And again, thank you very much, and have a good afternoon, and we will sign off.
Okay. Thank you. Linda.